people who come from the South tend to have lower incomes, whether they're black or white.
Okay, let's say then
history.
we're talking about people in the same region.
There would still be a difference. History would be one big one.
History, what do you mean by history?
All right.
The history of the race, or the history of the personal history of when they got here, or what?
The history of the group in the United States. That, for example, the Jews who came here with all sorts of urban skills. They were clothing industries.
Garment work.
Yes, that sort of thing. The Germans came here with all sorts of skill in beer making, piano making, machinery kinds of things. Blacks, of course, emerging from slavery had enormous disadvantages, even as compared to people emerging from slavery in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. Because, for one thing, in the United States, blacks were not allowed to have any responsibility under slavery. That one of the key ways of holding blacks in slavery at low cost was to keep the people dependent as much as possible. Now, people tried to do that in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't as possible, say, in the West Indies, because there weren't enough whites, for example, in the West Indies to matter. So if blacks were going to be fed in the West Indies, they had to be fed by growing their own food.
Like Angola and like the Portuguese colonies compared to, say, South Africa.
Yes. And so, therefore, the blacks, say, in the West Indies had all sorts of experience growing their own food, selling the surplus in the market, and, in fact, being responsible for budgeting what they had. Blacks in the United States were deliberately kept from having that. Dependence was seen as the key to holding the slaves down. It's ironic that that same principle comes up in the welfare state 100 years later.
Well, I was going to ask you that. You've anticipated me. To what extent do you find that then that the welfare state is trying to preserve an ethos which precisely, I understand you to say, we need to liberate ourselves from? Yes,
that politics really involves getting people to vote for you, and people vote for you when they think that they can depend on you, when they are dependent on you. To the extent that people become self-reliant and can feel they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves, to that extent do you lose your hold on their votes.
That's kind of a harsh generality, isn't it? Because a lot of people who really are philanthropically minded are in favor of the kind of thing that is generally understood as charitable intercession, isn't it?
Yes, there are people who are professional politicians who simply look at the bottom line of where the votes go. There are other people who sincerely believe that if they will hand out things here and there, that this will in fact benefit people. Again, looking at
your point is it doesn't.
It doesn't. I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. I've seen many examples around the world of people who began in poverty and ended in affluence. Not one of them has followed any pattern at all like what is being advocated for blacks in the United States. Many groups have remained in poverty for a very long time trying to follow those patterns.
These sort of permanent indigent classes.
That's right. Within the blacks, there's a very diverse movement, though. On the one hand, you have blacks who are getting more education, who are going to college, and so on. Their incomes are rising, not only absolutely, but relative to that of whites of the same description. It's those blacks who have not had, say, 9 years of schooling, who have not had 6 years of experience in the job market. Their incomes are declining relative to the incomes of whites. If over the very same span of time, so it can't be a matter of the business cycle or something like that, is that those blacks who have the advantages relative to others have now still more advantages. But those who had the very difficult poverty to deal with, that is becoming more difficult. A higher percentage of all black income is going to the top 20% of blacks over time.
Well, do I understand you to say that the government has exacerbated the plight of these poor blacks?
Yes.
How?
A number of ways. One, they've made it difficult to get jobs, to get started in the job market. Minimum wage law would be one of those things, but only one. The terrible schooling would be a major factor. That if you're going to turn out kids who are 40% functionally illiterate upon graduation from high school, then you're going to have very serious problems in the job market.
And the government is responsible for that?
The government runs the schools. Yes. State as well as federal. They're doing many things to make it much tougher for the person at the bottom to get started. And they're also making it less necessary to get started by having various subsidy programs, food stamps, welfare, and so on, which reduce the difference between working and not working. So that the general tendency of what they're doing is to make it harder to rise. But of course, if you're lucky enough to have started to rise before these programs began, then you're in great shape.
Well, now you point out in your book that one of the popular misconceptions is that the black families were headed by women as the result of of sundering families during the slave-owning era. You say that's incorrect, that traditionally there was a mother and a father in situ where black families existed. Then you make the following statement: the current large and rising numbers of female-headed families among blacks is a modern phenomenon stemming from the era of the welfare state, when the government began to subsidize desertion and teenage pregnancy.
Yes.
In what way is the government subsidizing teenage pregnancy?
Oh, the AFDC program.
You're concluding that there would be less of that pregnancy if there were less of that program?
I'm saying that historically there was a lot less of it before there were such programs in general. I'm citing there, for example, a study by Herbert Gutman, which took more than a decade, I believe. Again, what's striking to me is how long people repeated the statement that the female-headed black family was a legacy of slavery without ever bringing forth a single piece of evidence. Gutman spent more than 10 years looking into this, came up with exactly the opposite conclusion, that it was rare, particularly for teenage black women, to have children with no man in the house through the period that he covered, which is up to 1925. That those black women who had no husband typically were either widows or deserted or what have you. They were not teenage girls in most cases. I think in one period, 3% of the black families were headed by teenage girls.
And that figure is now over 50%.
I don't know what the teenage girl percentage is, but it's an awful lot.
Yeah,
it's an awful lot higher than that.
Yeah.